Someone at the funeral wanted me to believe the envelope didn't exist. That should have been the end of it, but I saw my mother-in-law slip it into her purse with hands that had never trembled before. I only caught 4 words written across the front, yet they refused to leave my mind. Do not tell Daniel. Why would a grieving widow hide a letter from her own son only hours after burying his father? What could possibly matter more than honesty on a day built around saying goodbye? I told myself to forget it, but then I noticed something even stranger. Every time Daniel turned toward his mother, she smiled with heartbreaking warmth. Every time he looked away, that smile disappeared as though someone had blown out a candle. I had never seen grief look so carefully rehearsed. Before sunset, another piece fell into place. A man in a charcoal suit approached Margaret near the cemetery gate, whispered something that made her face lose all color, then handed her a small brass key before walking away without attending the reception. She hid the key as quickly as she had hidden the envelope. By then I wasn't wondering whether there was a secret anymore. I was wondering how many years it had been buried. I married Daniel because he was honest in a world that rarely rewarded honesty. His father, Henry Collins, had always been the steady center of the family, the kind of man who remembered birthdays without reminders, fixed broken fences before anyone asked, and somehow made every Thanksgiving feel warmer simply by sitting at the head of the table. Losing him felt like losing the roof over all of us. The funeral was quiet, respectful, and full of neighbors whose stories painted Henry as a generous husband, father, and friend. Margaret accepted every embrace with remarkable grace. She thanked people, squeezed hands, and told everyone she would be all right. If I hadn't seen the envelope, I would have believed every word. After the last guests drifted away, Daniel volunteered to drive his aunt home, leaving me behind to help Margaret collect the flowers and sympathy cards. She insisted she could manage, but I stayed anyway. We worked mostly in silence until she suddenly excused herself, saying she needed a moment alone. Instead of heading toward the church office, she walked behind the old fellowship hall where no one else had gone all afternoon. Something about the way she looked over her shoulder stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't fear. It was caution. I waited a respectful distance away, telling myself I was imagining things. A few minutes later she returned, her expression calm again, but her purse looked noticeably heavier than before. On the drive home she barely spoke. Daniel assumed she was exhausted, and I agreed, though my thoughts never left that sealed envelope or the mysterious key. Late that evening, while Daniel fell asleep almost instantly after the longest day of his life, I stood alone at the kitchen window watching rain gather on the porch light. I wanted to believe grief explained everything I had seen. Yet deep inside, another feeling kept growing stronger. Henry Collins had been laid to rest that morning, but whatever story ended with his funeral had begun long before any of us realized it, and somehow, without meaning to, I had become the first person to notice the opening crack. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Margaret's fingers folding over the envelope, as though she was protecting something far more valuable than paper. By sunrise I had convinced myself that grief could make people behave in unusual ways. Losing a husband after more than 40 years of marriage had to leave invisible wounds that no one else could understand. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt because she had always treated me with kindness. She had never been controlling, never cruel, never the kind of mother-in-law people complained about. If anything, Margaret Collins had spent years making certain I always felt like family. That was exactly why none of this made sense. The next morning Daniel returned to work even though his co-workers had encouraged him to take more time off. He said staying busy was easier than sitting in an empty house thinking about his father. Before leaving, he kissed my forehead and asked if I could spend the afternoon with Margaret because he hated the thought of her being alone. I agreed without hesitation, although my reasons had quietly changed overnight. When I arrived at her house just before noon, the curtains were already open and soft classical music drifted through the kitchen window. Margaret was making coffee exactly the way she always had, measuring every spoonful carefully as though routine itself could keep grief under control. She smiled warmly when she saw me and thanked me for coming. For the first hour everything felt almost normal. We sorted sympathy cards, arranged flowers into smaller vases, and wrapped slices of pie for neighbors who had helped after the funeral. She even laughed once after finding an old photograph of Henry wearing an outrageous fishing hat from a family vacation in Minnesota. It was a genuine laugh, brief but real, and for a moment I felt guilty for doubting her. Then the telephone rang. Margaret glanced at the caller identification, and every trace of warmth disappeared from her face. She excused herself, carrying the cordless phone into the den before quietly closing the door behind her. I had no intention of listening, but the house was silent enough that a few words drifted into the hallway. No, not yet. Daniel cannot know. I promised him. Her voice was calm, almost practiced, but there was something underneath it that sounded heavier than sorrow. By the time she returned a few minutes later, she was smiling again as though nothing had happened. She explained that an insurance representative had called with paperwork questions. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet something inside me refused to settle. Later that afternoon she asked if I could carry a box of old photo albums down to the basement. While looking for an empty shelf, I noticed a metal filing cabinet tucked beneath the stairs. Every drawer except one stood slightly open. The locked drawer had fresh scratches around the keyhole, as though it had been opened repeatedly in recent days. I remembered the small brass key from the cemetery, and suddenly wondered if it belonged there. I turned away before curiosity pushed me further than my conscience would allow. On my way upstairs I found Margaret standing at the top of the basement steps. She was smiling, but her eyes were studying me with unusual intensity. She asked whether I had found enough space for the albums. I answered yes, and after a long pause she simply nodded. The moment passed, yet I could not shake the feeling that we had both been measuring each other without saying a single honest word. As I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, one thought echoed louder than the others. Whatever Margaret was protecting had not begun after Henry died. His passing had merely removed the last reason for keeping the truth hidden. The following afternoon I tried to focus on ordinary life. I answered work emails, folded laundry, and watered the flowers on our back porch, but every quiet task left room for the same unanswered questions. By early evening Daniel called to say he would be working late because several clients had insisted on meeting after hearing about his father's passing. Before hanging up he asked if I could stop by Margaret's house to bring over the homemade chicken soup we had prepared together the day before. It seemed like a simple favor, one I would have gladly done under any other circumstances. When I pulled into her driveway, her car was there, but the front door was slightly open. I knocked twice before stepping inside. The house was unusually quiet. The music that had been playing the day before was gone, replaced by complete silence. I called Margaret's name but received no answer. Assuming she was in the backyard, I carried the soup into the kitchen and set it on the counter. That was when I heard the faint sound of a printer running somewhere down the hallway. Curiosity pulled me toward Henry's old home office, a room that had remained untouched for years except for occasional dusting. The door stood open just enough for me to see the edge of the desk. Margaret was not inside. A printer sat beside an old desktop computer, and several freshly printed pages rested in the output tray. I had no intention of reading them, but one page had slipped onto the floor. Instinctively I bent down to place it back with the others. Before I could look away, a single line caught my attention. It read, "Property transfer record." Beneath those words was an address I had never heard before, followed by Henry Collins's name and another name I did not recognize. My heart began to race. It was not simply another property. According to the date, the transfer had taken place almost 30 years earlier. I carefully placed the page back where I had found it, ashamed that I had seen even that much. At that exact moment I heard footsteps approaching. Margaret entered carrying a cardboard box filled with old file folders. She froze when she noticed me standing near the printer. For a second neither of us spoke. Then she smiled gently and apologized for taking so long. She explained that she had been organizing tax records in the garage and had forgotten I was coming. Her voice sounded steady, but her hands tightened around the box just enough for several folders to slide sideways. One folder slipped free and landed on the carpet. A faded photograph fell out. Margaret reached it before I could. Yet not before I caught a glimpse of Henry standing beside a small white farmhouse with another older woman smiling beside him. It did not look like a casual snapshot. It looked like a memory someone had carefully protected for decades. Margaret quietly tucked the photograph back into the folder and changed the subject, asking whether Daniel had been eating properly since the funeral. I answered her question, but my mind remained fixed on the picture. During dinner that evening, I casually asked Daniel whether his father had ever owned another house before they moved into the family home. He looked puzzled and shook his head without hesitation. He said his parents had always lived in the same place for as long as he could remember, and that Henry had never mentioned owning any other property. The certainty in his voice unsettled me even more because I no longer knew whether Henry had kept secrets from his son, or whether someone else had quietly rewritten the family's history long before I ever became part of it. I spent the next 2 days telling myself to stop chasing shadows. Families carried old memories, forgotten properties, faded photographs, and unfinished conversations all the time. None of that automatically meant deception. Yet every reasonable explanation seemed to collapse the moment I remembered the words I had overheard. Daniel cannot know. Those 4 words echoed louder than anything else because they were never followed by an explanation. If Margaret had simply been protecting legal paperwork until everything was settled, why hide it from the one person who had every right to see it? On Thursday morning, while Daniel was already downtown meeting clients, I drove to the county records office with nothing more than the unfamiliar address I had memorized from the document beside the printer. I almost turned around twice before reaching the building. It felt wrong to investigate my husband's family without telling him, but another part of me believed that if I ignored what I had seen, I might eventually become another person silently carrying secrets. The records clerk greeted me with professional kindness and explained that older property information was available through public archives. I asked whether I could search by address instead of owner. She nodded and pointed me toward a public computer terminal. My hands felt unusually cold as I typed each number exactly as I remembered it. Within seconds, several records appeared on the screen. The oldest entry listed Henry Collins as the purchaser nearly 30 years earlier. That alone surprised me. What stunned me was the next transfer. 5 years later, ownership had quietly changed to a woman named Eleanor Brooks. There was no sale price listed, only a notation indicating a private transfer recorded through an attorney. I stared at the screen trying to understand what I was looking at. There was nothing illegal about the record. Everything appeared properly filed. The mystery was not the transaction itself. The mystery was why no one in the family had ever mentioned that the property existed. Before leaving, I copied only the public reference number into a small notebook. I did not print anything because I already felt as though I had crossed an invisible line. On my way back to the parking lot, my telephone rang. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. A calm female voice introduced herself as Olivia Brooks, the attorney who had handled several matters for Henry over the years. She immediately apologized for calling the wrong Emily Collins. Apparently, she had intended to reach another client with the same first and last name. Before ending the conversation, she hesitated and quietly asked one unexpected question. "You are not related to Margaret Collins by any chance, are you?" My heartbeat quickened. I answered that Margaret was my mother-in-law. There was a long silence on the other end before Olivia spoke again. Her tone became careful, almost cautious. "Then please forgive the mistake. I should not have called." She ended the conversation before I could ask another question. I sat in my car for several minutes holding the silent telephone. The coincidence felt almost impossible. The attorney shared the same last name as the woman listed on the property transfer. I told myself Brooks was a common surname, yet my instincts refused to dismiss it so easily. That evening, Margaret invited Daniel and me over for dinner. She looked peaceful, almost lighter than she had since the funeral, as though making us meatloaf and mashed potatoes gave her a welcome return to ordinary life. Across the table, she smiled as Daniel described a childhood fishing trip with his father. Margaret listened quietly before correcting one small detail about the lake they had visited. It was such an ordinary family conversation that no one else would have noticed anything unusual. But I did. For the first time since Henry's funeral, Margaret looked directly at me after finishing her sentence, and in that brief moment I had the unmistakable feeling that she already knew someone had started following the trail she had spent decades trying to keep hidden. The next morning I promised myself I would not take another step unless the truth found me first. I had already learned more than I ever intended, and every answer seemed to uncover 2 new questions. I spent the morning cleaning the house trying to settle my thoughts, when the doorbell rang just after 11. Standing on the porch was a woman I had never met before. She looked to be in her early 70s, dressed in a navy blue coat despite the mild weather, with silver hair neatly pulled back and kind gray eyes that seemed unusually tired. She asked very politely if I was Emily Collins. When I nodded, she introduced herself as Eleanor Brooks. My heart skipped before she even said another word. It was the same name I had seen in the county records. She noticed the surprise on my face and gave a quiet smile that carried more sadness than warmth. She said she had debated for years whether she should ever come to our family, but after reading Henry's obituary she realized she no longer had the luxury of waiting. I invited her inside without fully understanding why. We sat at the kitchen table with untouched cups of coffee growing cold between us. Eleanor looked around the room for several moments before speaking. She told me she had known Henry for a very long time, longer than most people realized. She quickly added that there had never been anything inappropriate between them, and that she wanted to make that clear before saying anything else. Her words immediately eased the fear that had quietly begun forming in my mind. Instead, she explained that she and Henry had shared a responsibility that almost no one knew about. Before I could ask what she meant, she reached into her handbag and placed a worn manila envelope on the table. Across the front was Henry's handwriting. I recognized it from birthday cards he had given Daniel every year. My hands froze. Eleanor did not push the envelope toward me. Instead, she rested her hand gently on top of it and looked directly into my eyes. "Margaret has carried this burden alone for far too long," she said softly. She kept her promise because Henry asked her to. But promises sometimes become heavier than the people carrying them. I asked why she had come to me instead of speaking directly to Margaret. Eleanor sighed before answering. She explained that Margaret would never break the promise on her own, no matter how much it hurt her, because loyalty had always mattered more to her than comfort. Then she surprised me again by saying something I never expected. If anyone can convince her that it is finally time, it will not be her son. It will be you. My thoughts raced faster than I could organize them. I wanted to open the envelope immediately, yet something about Eleanor's calm expression made me hesitate. She slowly removed her hand from the paper but did not encourage me to read it. Instead, she asked me one simple question. Has Daniel ever wondered why his father insisted on driving to Cedar Ridge every spring by himself? I searched my memory and realized Henry had always disappeared for one weekend every April. Daniel used to joke that his father simply needed a break from mowing the lawn and fixing things around the house. None of us had questioned it because every family had small traditions that belonged to one person alone. Eleanor quietly nodded as though she had expected that answer. She stood to leave but paused near the front door. Before stepping outside, she turned back and said, "When Margaret finally tells the truth, do not judge her by the years she stayed silent. Judge her by the reason she believed silence was the only way to protect the people she loved." After she drove away, I remained standing in the hallway with Henry's envelope resting in my hands. For several long minutes I stared at the familiar handwriting, knowing that whatever waited inside had already shaped our family long before I ever became part of it. For nearly an hour I sat at the kitchen table with Henry's envelope resting untouched in front of me. I had promised myself from the beginning that I would never become someone who searched through another person's private life, simply because curiosity demanded it. Yet this felt different now. Eleanor had not stumbled into my life by accident. She had come with purpose, and somehow that purpose had become mine. I finally broke the seal with careful hands, unfolding a single handwritten letter and several official documents clipped neatly behind it. Henry's familiar handwriting covered the first page. He addressed the letter to Margaret, not to Daniel, not to me, but to the woman who had stood beside him through every season of his life. His first sentence made my breath catch. "If you are reading this, then I have finally left you to carry the promise we made together." There was nothing dramatic about his words. They were calm, thoughtful, almost gentle. Henry explained that 30 years earlier his closest friend had passed away unexpectedly, leaving behind his elderly mother, Eleanor, with no family willing or able to care for her. Pride had kept her from accepting charity, and she refused to move into assisted living because the small farmhouse where she had spent her entire life was all she had left. Henry wrote that he could not walk away from someone who had once treated him like a son during the difficult years before he married Margaret. Together, He and Margaret quietly purchased the property through legal channels and transferred it into Eleanor's name so she could remain there with dignity, never knowing the full extent of their sacrifice. The yearly trips to Cedar Ridge had never been vacations or secret meetings. Henry had driven there every spring to repair the roof, paint the porch, maintain the well, and make certain Eleanor never felt abandoned. Margaret had often wanted Daniel to know the truth after he became an adult, but Henry always refused. He believed kindness lost something precious the moment it became a story told for admiration. They agreed that the secret would remain hidden unless keeping it became harmful. I reached the final page with tears quietly gathering in my eyes. Henry ended the letter with one request. If circumstances ever forced Margaret to reveal everything after his death, he begged her not to feel ashamed for staying silent because every choice they had made had come from compassion rather than fear. The remaining documents confirmed every detail. There were maintenance receipts, trust records, and letters from Eleanor thanking an unnamed benefactor she had never fully identified. Nothing pointed toward greed, betrayal, or hidden wealth. Instead, every piece of paper reflected decades of quiet generosity. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed by relief and regret at the same time. I had spent days wondering whether Margaret had hidden something selfish when in reality, she had been protecting the final wish of the man she loved. Yet one question still refused to disappear. If the truth was this honorable, why had she whispered that Daniel could not know? Why had she looked so frightened at the funeral? As though answering my thoughts, my telephone rang. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. Her voice sounded unusually soft when I answered. She asked whether I could come over that evening because there was something she had tried to say several times but had never found the courage to begin. Before ending the call, she added one quiet sentence that settled heavily over my heart. "Emily, I think it is finally time for Daniel to know everything. But I am terrified that after all these years he will misunderstand why his father and I chose silence." That evening the drive to Margaret's house felt longer than it ever had before. The envelope rested safely inside my bag. Yet I no longer saw it as evidence of deception. It had become the final chapter of a love story built on quiet sacrifice. When Daniel and I walked through the front door, Margaret was already waiting in the living room. She had prepared coffee and a small plate of oatmeal cookies, just as she always did whenever family visited. The familiar routine made the room feel warm, but the expression on her face told me she had already made the hardest decision of her life. She asked us to sit down before disappearing briefly into Henry's old office. When she returned, she carried the same worn folder I had seen days earlier, along with the small brass key that had first caught my attention at the cemetery. She placed both items on the coffee table without saying a word. Daniel looked confused. He asked gently whether something was wrong. Margaret took a slow breath before answering. She admitted that she and Henry had hidden something from him for many years, not because they doubted his character, but because they believed they were honoring a promise that mattered deeply to his father. Daniel immediately assumed the worst. His shoulders stiffened, and I could see questions racing through his mind. Before fear could fill the silence, I quietly reached into my bag and placed Henry's letter beside Margaret's folder. She looked at me with surprise, then understanding. Without anger or accusation, I explained that Eleanor had visited me and trusted me with the letter because she believed the time had finally come. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and whispered that Henry had always said the truth would eventually find its own path. Daniel carefully unfolded the handwritten pages and began reading. The room remained completely silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. As he turned each page, the tension slowly left his face. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became quiet reflection. By the time he reached the final paragraph, tears filled his eyes. He looked up at his mother with an expression I had not seen since the day of Henry's funeral. It was not disappointment. It was heartbreak mixed with admiration. He quietly asked why they had never trusted him enough to tell him after he became an adult. Margaret answered with complete honesty. She said they had considered it many times, but every year Henry reminded her that true generosity asked for nothing in return, not even recognition from the people they loved most. She admitted that after Henry became ill, she feared revealing everything would make Daniel believe his father wanted praise instead of privacy. Daniel lowered his head and held the letter against his chest for several long moments. Finally he stood, walked across the room, and embraced his mother without speaking. Margaret broke into tears for the first time since the funeral, not because another burden had been placed upon her, but because one she had carried alone for decades had finally been lifted. As I watched them hold each other, I realized the greatest secret in this family had never been hidden money or forgotten property. It had been the extraordinary kindness of two ordinary people, who believed that doing the right thing only mattered if no one was watching. Yet even as peace slowly settled into the room, Margaret glanced toward the brass key still resting on the table and quietly said there was one last place Henry had asked her to visit after the truth was finally revealed, and what waited there belonged to Daniel now. The following Saturday morning the three of us left before sunrise. Margaret carried the small brass key in the pocket of her light gray coat, holding it so tightly that I wondered whether she had done the same every April when Henry made his quiet trip to Cedar Ridge. The drive took a little more than 2 hours, winding through gentle hills and narrow country roads until the landscape opened into wide fields surrounded by old maple trees. Daniel remained unusually quiet. Every now and then he glanced at the letter resting on his lap, reading a few familiar lines before carefully folding it again. None of us felt the need to fill the silence. It was the kind of silence shared by people who had finally stopped searching for someone to blame. When we reached the small white farmhouse, I immediately recognized it from the faded photograph I had glimpsed in Margaret's office. Time had left its mark on the wooden porch and weathered fence, yet the house still carried a sense of warmth that photographs alone could never capture. Eleanor was already waiting outside, sitting in a rocking chair with a gentle smile. She greeted Daniel as though she had known him all his life, although they had never truly met. After a long embrace with Margaret, she reached into her sweater pocket and handed the brass key back to Daniel. She quietly explained that it had never belonged to her. It had always been intended for him, but only after he understood why his parents had protected this place for so many years. Together we walked into the farmhouse. The rooms were modest, filled with handmade quilts, family photographs, and shelves lined with well-loved books. Nothing inside suggested wealth or luxury. Instead, everything reflected a lifetime built on gratitude and careful stewardship. Eleanor led us to a small writing desk near the front window. Daniel inserted the brass key into its only locked drawer. Inside rested a simple wooden box along with several neatly organized notebooks. Margaret smiled through quiet tears as she recognized Henry's handwriting on the covers. Daniel slowly opened the first notebook. It was not a financial ledger or a collection of legal records. It was a journal. Year after year Henry had written about the weekends he spent repairing the farmhouse, planting flowers, replacing broken windows, and sharing meals with Eleanor. Yet what touched Daniel most was that nearly every entry included his name. Henry often wrote that one day he hoped his son would become the kind of man who helped others even when nobody applauded. He believed the greatest inheritance he could leave behind was not money or property, but an example worth following. Margaret admitted she had read only the first few pages after Henry passed away because finishing the journals without him had felt impossible. Daniel quietly continued reading while Eleanor walked us through the house, pointing out small repairs Henry had completed over the decades. Every shelf, every painted wall, every carefully maintained window seemed to carry another silent reminder that kindness often leaves fingerprints no one notices. Before we left, Eleanor asked Daniel for one final favor. She said she would likely move into a nearby retirement community within the next year, because caring for the property had become difficult. She did not ask him to keep the farmhouse. She only asked that whoever owned it next would understand why it had been preserved with so much love. Daniel looked around the room one last time before answering with complete certainty. He said his father had protected this home for 3 decades without expecting recognition, and he intended to honor that legacy by protecting it for as long as he could. As we stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, I realized that Henry's greatest secret had never hidden our family from the truth. It had quietly guided us toward becoming the people he had always hoped we would be. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that weekend in Cedar Ridge. Grief still visited our family in quiet moments. We still reached for the telephone before remembering Henry would never answer again. We still caught ourselves saving stories to tell him before realizing those conversations now lived only in memory. But something important had changed. The silence that once separated us had finally been replaced with understanding. Over the following months Daniel visited the farmhouse every few weeks. Sometimes Margaret went with him. Sometimes I joined them. Other times he made the drive alone, just as his father had done for so many years. He repaired loose fence boards, planted fresh flowers beneath the front windows, and learned how to maintain the old water pump with instructions Henry had carefully written inside one of the journals. Eleanor often watched from her porch with the same peaceful smile, insisting she had never expected anyone to continue what Henry had started. Daniel always answered the same way. He would tell her that kindness did not end simply because the person who began it was gone. It grew stronger when someone else quietly chose to continue it. One evening Margaret invited us to dinner again. For the first time since Henry's funeral, laughter filled the dining room without guilt. We shared simple food, looked through old family photographs, and read passages from Henry's journals aloud. In nearly every entry he had written about ordinary moments that most people would have forgotten. A repaired porch step, a shared slice of apple pie, a long conversation while watching autumn leaves fall across the fields. He understood something many people spend their entire lives chasing. A meaningful life is rarely built through grand achievements. More often it is built through thousands of quiet choices that no one else ever notices. Before we left that evening, Margaret handed Daniel one final envelope. This one contained a short note Henry had written only a few weeks before his passing. Daniel read it slowly, then smiled through tears. His father had written that every family eventually carries a secret. Some secrets protect pride. Others protect fear. He hoped the only secret their family would ever be remembered for was the one created out of compassion. He ended with a single request. If the truth ever becomes known, do not waste your energy asking why we stayed silent. Instead, ask yourself who might need your kindness next. Months later, Eleanor decided she was finally ready to move into a comfortable retirement community closer to medical care and new friends. She insisted the farmhouse belonged to its future rather than its past. Daniel honored her wishes by creating a small charitable trust in Henry's name to preserve the property and support older homeowners in the surrounding county who struggled to maintain their homes alone. Margaret quietly attended the dedication ceremony without standing at the front or asking anyone to recognize her. That choice felt exactly like something she and Henry would have made together. Looking back now, I realize I spent days believing I was uncovering a story about hidden betrayal. Instead, I discovered something much rarer. I learned that the deepest truths are not always dark. Sometimes they are simply protected until the right hearts are ready to understand them. Henry left behind no great fortune, no famous legacy, and no public monument. What he left instead was a family that finally understood the true measure of character. It is not found in the kindness everyone sees. It is found in the kindness that continues even when no one is watching.